Welcome again. In this video, we are going to cover chapter 11 of book Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Chapter 11, Reasonable is greater than rational. Aiming to be mostly reasonable works better than trying to be coldly rational. You are not a spreadsheet, you are a person, a screwed up emotional person. It took me a while to figure this out, but once it clicked, I realized it's one of the most important parts of finance. When it comes to something that often goes overlooked, do not aim to be coldly rational when making financial decisions. Aim to just be pretty reasonable. Reasonable is more realistic, and you have a better chance of sticking with it for the long run, which is what matters most when managing money. To show you what I mean, let me tell you the story of a guy who tried to cure syphilis with malaria. Julius Wagner Jauger was a 19th century psychiatrist with two unique skills. He was good at recognizing patterns and what others saw as crazy he found merely bald. His specialty was patients with severe neurophilia, then a fatal diagnosis with no known treatment. He began noticing a pattern. Syphilis patients tended to recover if they had the added misfortune of having prolonged fevers from an unrelated ailment. Wagner Julius assumed this was due to a hunch that had been around for centuries but doctors didn't understand well. Fevers play a role in helping the body fight infection. So he jumped to the logical conclusion. In the early 1900s, Wagner Jurek began injecting patients with low end strains of typhoid, malaria, and smallpox to trigger fevers strong enough to kill off their syphilis. This was as dangerous as it sounds. Some of his patients died from the treatment. He eventually settled on a weak version of malaria since it could be effectively countered with quinine after a few days of bone rattling fevers. After some tragic trial and error, his experiment worked. Wagner Jaeger reported that 6 in 10 Phillies patients treated with malotherapy recovered compared to around 3 in 10 patients left alone. He won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. The organization today notes the main work this concerned Wagner during throughout his working life was the endeavor to cure mental disease by inducing a fever. Penicillin eventually made malotherapy for therapy for Salfield's patients obsolete, thank goodness, but Wagner Jauregg is one of the only doctors in history who not only recognized fever's role in fighting infection but also prescribed it as a treatment. Fevers have always been as feared as they are mysterious. Ancient Romans worshipped Febris, the goddess who protected people from fevers. Amulets were left at temples to placate her, hoping to stave off the next round of shivers. But Jagner Joggers was on to something. Fevers are not accidental nuisance, they do play a role in the body's road to recovery. We now have better, more scientific evidence of fevers' useless usefulness in fighting infection. A 1 degree increase in body temperature has been shown to slow the replication rate of some viruses by a factor of 200. Numerous investigations had identified a better outcome among patients who displayed fever. One NIH paper writes the Seattle Children's Hospital includes a section on its website to educate parents who may panic at the slightest rise in their child's temperature. Fever turns on the body's immune system. They help the body fight infection. Normal fevers between 100 and 104 degree Fahrenheit are good for sick children. But that's where the science ends and reality takes over. Fever is almost universally seen as a bad thing. They are treated with drugs like Tylenol to reduce them too quickly as they appear. Despite millions of years of evolution as a defense mechanism, no parent, no patient, few doctors, and certainly no drug company view fever as anything but a misfortune that should be eliminated. These views do not match the non science. Only study was blunt. Treatment of fever is common in the ICU setting and likely related to standard dogma rather than evidence based practice. Howard Market, director of the Center of the History of Medicine, once said of fever phobia, these are cultural practices that spread just as widely as the infectious disease that are behind them. Why does this happen if fevers are beneficial? Why do we fight them so universally? I don't think it's complicated. Fever hurts, and people don't want to hurt. That's it. A doctor's goal is not just to cure disease, it's to cure disease within the confines of what's reasonable and tolerable to the patient. Fevers can have marginal benefits in fighting infection, but they hurt. And I go to the doctor to stop hurting. I don't care about double blind studies when I am shivering under a blanket. If you have a pill that can make a fever stop, give it to me now. It may be rational to want a fever if you have an infection, but it's not reasonable. That philosophy, aiming to be reasonable instead of rational, is one more people should consider when making decisions with their money. Academic finance is devoted to finding the mathematical optimal investment strategies. My own theory is that in the real world, people do not want the mathematical optimal strategy, they want the strategy that maximizes for how well they sleep at night. Harry Markowitz won the Nobel Prize for exploring the mathematical trade off between risk and return. He was once asked how he invested his own money and described his portfolio allocation in the 1950 when his models were first developed. I visualized my grief if the stock market went way up and I wasn't in it, or if it went way down and I was completely in it. My intention was to minimize my future regrets, so I split my contribution 50 by 50 between bond and equities. Markowitz eventually changed his investment strategy, diversifying the mix, but two things here are important. One is that minimizing future regret is hard to rationalize on paper but easy to justify in real life. A rational investor makes decisions based on numeric facts. A reasonable investor makes them in conference room surrounded by co-workers. You want them in a conference room to think highly of you with spouse you don't want to let down, or judged against the silly but realistic competitors that are your brother-in-law, your neighbor, and your personal doubts. Investing has a social component that often ignored when viewed through a strictly financial lens. The second is that this is fine. Jason Zweig, who conducted the interview when Markovich described how he invested, later reflected, my own view is that people are neither rational nor irrational. We are human. We don't like to think harder than we need to, and we have unceasing demands on our attentions. Seen in that light, there's nothing surprising about the fact that the pioneer of modern portfolio theory built his initial portfolio with so little regard for his own research, nor is it surprising that he adjusted it later. Markevist is neither rational or irrational, he is reasonable. What's often overlooked in finance is that something can be technically true but contextually nonsense. In 2008, a pair of researchers from Yale published a study arguing young savers should supercharge their retirement outcomes accounts using 2 to 1 margin, $2 of depth for every $1 of their own money. When buying stocks, it suggests investors taper that leverage as they age, which lets a saver take more risk when they are young and can handle a magnified market roller coaster, and less when they are older. Even if using leverage left you wiped out when you are very young, if you use 2 to 1 margin, a 50% market drop leaves you with nothing. The researcher showed savers would still be better off in the long run, so as long as they picked themselves back up, followed the plan, and kept saving in a 2 to 1 leveraged account the day after being wiped out. The math works on paper, it's a rational strategy, but it's almost absurdly unreasonable. No normal person could watch 100% of their retirement account evaporate and be so unfazed that they carry on with the strategy undeterred. They had quit to look for a different option and perhaps sue their financial advisor. The researchers argued that when using their strategy, the expected retirement wealth is 90% of higher compared to life cycles fund. It's also 100% less reasonable. There, in fact, a rational reason to favor what looks like irrational decisions. Here's one. Let me suggest that you love your investments. This is not traditional advice, it's almost a badge of honor for investors to claim they are emotionless about their investments because it seems rational. Back, if lacking emotions about your strategy or the stocks you own increase the odds you will walk away from them when they become difficult. What looks like rational thinking becomes a liability. The reasonable investors who love their technically imperfect strategies have an edge because they are more likely to stick with those strategies. There are few financial variables more correlated to the performance than commitment to a strategy during its lean year. Both the amount of performance and the odds of capturing it over a given period of time. The historical odds of making money in US markets are 50 by 50 over 1 day period. 68% in 1 year period, 88% in 10-year period, and so far 100% of 20-year periods. Anything that keeps you in the game has a quantifiable advantage. If you view do what you love as a guide to a happier life, it sounds like empty fortune cookie advice. If you view it as the thing providing the endurance necessary to put the quantifiable odds of success in your favor, you realize it should be the most important part of any financial strategy. Invest in a promising company you don't care about, and you must enjoy it when everything going well. But when the tide inevitable turns, you are suddenly losing money on something you are not interested in. It's a double burden, and the path of least resistance is to move on something else. If you are passionate about the company to begin with, you love the mission, the product, the team, the science, whatever the inevitable down times when you are losing money or the company needs help, something helps are blunted by the fact that at least you feel like you are part of something meaningful. That can be necessary motivation that prevents you from giving up and moving on. There are several other times when it's fine to be reasonable instead of rational with money. There's a well documented home bias where people prefer to invest in companies from the country they live in while ignoring the other 95% of the planet. If it's not rational until you consider that investing is efficiently giving money to strangers. If familiarity helps you to take the leap of faith required to remain backing those strangers, it's reasonable. Day trading and picking individual stock is not rational for most investors. The odds are heavily against your success, but they are both reasonable in small amounts if they scratch an itch hard enough to leave the rest of your more diversified investments alone. Investor Josh Brown, who advocates and mostly owns diversified funds, once explained why he also owns a smattering of individual stocks. I am not buying individual stocks because I think I am going to generate alpha outperformance. I just love stocks and have ever since I was 20 years old, and it's my money. I get to do whatever quite reasonable. Most forecasts about where the economy and the stock market are heading next are terrible, but making forecasts is reasonable. It's hard to wake up in the morning telling yourself you have no clue what the future holds. Even if it's true, acting on investment forecast is dangerous. But I get why people try to predict what will happen next year. It's human nature, it's reasonable. Jack Bogle, the late founder of Vanguard, spent his career on a crusade to promote low cost passive index investing. Many thought it interesting that his son found a career as an active high fee hedge fund and mutual fund manager. Bogle, the man who said high fee funds violate the humble rules of arithmetic, invested some of his own money in his future's fund, his son's fund. What's the explanation? We do some things for family reason. Bold at the Wall Street Journal. If it's not consistent, well, life isn't always consistent. Indeed, it really is. We have completed our chapter 11 of book Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. In next video, we are going to complete the chapter 12. Okay. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.